Last week we started a series on stewardship that comes from the 50th Psalm. And in that sermon we barely spoke at all about money or giving or anything like that. Instead, we focused where the psalm focused, and that was on the glory and the majesty of the Almighty God Most High that we serve and that we worship. And in the beginning of that psalm, we saw that the Mighty One, God, Yahweh, came down from heaven to earth. He came down shining forth in beauty, in holiness, in perfection. We see Him coming down as terrible and awesome. We see Him as a roaring fire, as thundering water, and this great and awesome God summons mankind. This call goes forth across heaven and earth to all the people from the rising of the sun to the setting of the sun, and from out of the people of the earth, this great God specifically summons His people. And He calls heaven and He calls earth to be a witness as He comes to judge them. And so we spent our time last week worshiping our holy, mighty, awesome God, and that was from Psalm 50, verses 1 through 6. We're going to continue in the psalm and look at verses 7 through 14 this morning as God comes to judge. And He says, "Listen, my people, and I will speak. I will testify against you, Israel. I am God, your God. I bring no charges against you concerning your sacrifices or concerning your burnt offerings, which are ever before me. But I have no need of a bull from your stall or a goat from your pens. For every animal of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird in the mountains, and the insects in the field are mine. If I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you, for the world is mine and all that is in it. If I were hungry, I already read that. Do I eat the flesh of bulls or drink the blood of goats?" So God comes down. He summons His people. His purpose is to judge them. And He begins by testifying against them in court. And He says, "Listen, my people, I will speak. I'm God, your God." And He says, "I don't bring charges against you concerning your sacrifices or your burnt offerings," because He says, "These are ever before me." God's people were consistently bringing sacrifices to Him. That's something they were doing. They were doing what God had commanded them to do. They were obeying the law, the letter of the law. They were correct in their external worship to God. That's what He says. He said, that's not the testimony that I bring against you, but there is a problem. And we're having to read a little bit into what He is saying here, but I think we're going to be pretty consistent with this text that the problem that He sees in them then, and it is in reality a problem that is very often true for religious people. And I mean that in the best sense of the word. For people who love God and want to worship Him and want to honor Him and want to obey His commandments. And that problem is a heart problem. We can be doing all the right things externally. That's what God says they were doing. They were doing the right things externally. He is not bringing that against them. But in their minds, they were misunderstanding who God was and what He was looking for from them. Their hearts were in the wrong place. We can call this problem a lot of names. I'm going to call it ritualism this morning. Ritualism. Going through the motions. And it's a problem we're all prone to, and I think it's a sticky problem for this reason. We have to go through the motions. We're here this morning. We're here because God asked us to be here. We're here because we want to be here. We have to go through motions. We have to go through rituals. We have to go through routines. We have to go through rhythms in our relationship with God, in our worship to God. And those rhythms and those routines and those rituals are actually meaningful to us. And they help us. In terms of stewardship, as I think about a ritual that I witnessed every Sunday morning when I was growing up. This was the ritual in my family when it came to giving. The Holsberries would go in and sit on the third row from the front on the right side. This is completely an aside, but there were these huge beams that went across our auditorium, and we sat right under one, and that really worried me as a little kid. I don't know why I just thought of that, but I'm just thinking about this ritual. We went in, we sat down, and my mama would pull out her checkbook, and she would write out her check. Now, I want to clarify, they had already decided, it wasn't a last-minute thing, they had already decided every month what they were going to give, but this was the ritual, this was the routine. She didn't write it early. She didn't write it the night before. We sat down, and her first order of business was to take out her checkbook. She would write out the check. She would fold it. I don't know why I remember all these specific details, but it happened every single week. She would fold the check. She would hand it over us to my daddy, who would slide it into his pocket, and then when the plates were passed, he would take it out and he would give. That ritual, that routine spoke volumes to me. I clearly see it happening in my mind's eye. My parents modeled through a ritual, through a routine, that godly act of giving of their first fruits back to Him. And so when I say this is a sticky problem, I mean that sincerely. We need those rituals. We need those routines. We need those rhythms in our life that keep us in contact with God, that help us obey His commands and do what He has asked us to do. But the problem is, they become rituals. They become routines. And we need also constant reminders. Just like we were given in the first verses of chapter 50 of Psalm 50, we need those constant reminders of just who it is that we are worshiping. Who it is that is the purpose and the reason behind these rituals and these routines, and that He wants our heart to be in it. He desires our heart. Your lips are speaking for me, but your heart is far from me, He says in the Old Testament, and Jesus repeats it in the New Testament. Those rituals and routines and rhythms can get in the way of our worship because our focus is on them rather than on the one to whom they point. As I was thinking about this, one of the current routines that we have that can quickly become mindless and thoughtless is online giving. In fact, talking about my mama, she and I had this conversation the other day because I was reminding her of this part of the sermon that I was going to share, and she has resisted online giving until very recently because she had a routine and a rhythm of the way that she gave. But as I was thinking about this, online giving can become a problem for us. Now, church leaders love online giving. I'm serious, because it is a rhythm and it is a ritual that happens every week, whether you intend it to or not, once you set it up. And so the inflow of your giving is not restricted by vacations and weather and attendance patterns. So church leaders all love online giving, but I'm telling you, as I've been thinking about this, what online giving can do is literally completely separate us from our giving. It's mindless. We do it one time and we don't think about it again. And it just keeps happening. And there's good in that and there's bad in that. Because it separates us from the act. It separates us from the sacrifice, from the moment of actually having to give something. And there's probably some things we need to think about in there. And that I am thinking about as we talk about this. But we need reminders, like we received from the first verses of Psalm 50, of who He is and what He requires of us. And God took them to account because of their ritualism without the heart. They had all the externals down, but they were neglecting the internals. But He also took them account. There's two things here, I think. He also took them to account because they really had a wrong theology. A wrong way of thinking about God had crept into their worship because of their rituals and routines and rhythms. See, apparently, the way the psalm is worded, they had begun to think that God needed their sacrifice. They had begun to think that in some way God was dependent on them. That by their giving, they were giving something to God that He needed, that He did not already have. And God spends most of these verses making it very clear that that is wrong thinking and that is wrong theology, that they are mistaken. He says, I have no need of a bull from your stalls or a goat from your pens. And then these beautiful verses that most of us kind of know in our mind and heart, that every animal of the forest is mine. That the cattle on 1,000 hills are His. And I personally love that verse because I love looking out on my hill and seeing my cows. And I remind myself those belong to God. Then I think it's fascinating that He goes on and He says every bird in the mountains, He knows them. What does Jesus say about a sparrow? Not a sparrow falls that God doesn't know it. God's not just being poetic here. God literally means this. And then this one really fascinates me because I walk through my field and there are thousands of little creatures there that you can see and that you can't see. And God says, I know every insect that is crawling through the fields of the world. There is not a single thing that isn't God's. There's not anything in all of the earth that isn't His. There's not anything above the earth that isn't His. There's not anything below the earth that isn't His. There's not anything that comes out of the earth that isn't His. I don't know how to go much further than that. There is not anything that is not God's. There is not anything that has ever existed. There has not been anything that has ever been created that does not belong to God. He is the Lord, the creator of heaven and earth. And it all belongs to Him. I don't know that I get this. I don't know if you get this. I think it is too big for us to grasp in some ways, but it's something we've got to deal with and think about and remind ourselves of. Because the reality is we are surrounded by man-made things. I think to our detriment. We're surrounded by man-made things. Our whole world happens and works because of stuff that man makes. Man-made technology. Boy, when the electricity goes out, we think, oh my goodness, how are we going to survive? Man-made toys. We all got lots and lots of toys. Man-made gadgets, man-made materials. It's so easy to exalt our own ability to sustain ourselves and to provide for everything we need and everything we want. It is very easy for us to forget God in our daily existence. It reminds me of an old joke that The scientist approached God and said, listen, God, we've decided that we don't need you anymore. These days we can clone people, we can transplant organs, we can do all kinds of things that people used to call a miracle. God says, you don't need me. Okay, you think you can create? Well, okay, let's just do this. Well, you create a man and I'll create a man. The scientist said, okay, we can do that. And he reached down and he grabbed a dirt and God said, make your own dirt. Now, the joke is not on scientists. The joke's on us. We have become so removed from reality that a lot of kids don't know that milk comes from cows. We don't know where our food comes from. Everything comes from God. And we are lulled into leaving God out of the picture when it comes to our life and to our ability to create and provide for ourselves. But the reality is, we can't create anything that hasn't already been created. It's God's building blocks that we use to make all the things that we make. Unless we are arrogant enough to think, yeah, but I work hard for what I have, it is God who gives you the ability to work. It is God who makes your muscles work. It is God who makes your mind work. It is God who gives you the breath of life. There is literally no way we can ever back up far enough to separate ourselves from our complete dependence on God, because everything belongs to Him. None of it is mine. Anything I have is a gift from Him. There's nothing you can point to and say mine. I mean that. There is nothing you can point to and say mine. The house you live in, unless you built it, was somebody else's before you moved in. And even if you built it, it's going to be somebody else's when you're gone. If that's true for something as permanent as a house, how much more true is that for your clothes, for your food, for your books, for your bed, for your phone, for your bank account? God sums it up in verse 12 when He says, the world is mine and all that is in it. And I think that's what God wants us to get. It's what He called Israel to court for. And I think it's what He still calls His people to court about. God bless you for going through the motions, for having the rituals and the routines and the rhythms in your life that keep you in worship and keep you in giving and keep you in obeying the commandments. But don't ever, ever get removed from the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter is, it's all God's. The verse that we read earlier that Chris read for us ends by saying, we only give you what is already your own. We only give you what is already your own. And as I close this out this morning, I've just been reminded a couple of times recently that all the resources in the world are God's, and He will always use them and move them and direct them in such a way that His will and purpose is accomplished. And in the Old Testament, we see that He did that twice through Egypt. One I had forgotten about. When Abraham went to Egypt because of a famine in the land, and there's a whole story there about his wife that I won't get into, but when Abraham left Egypt, the king, the Pharaoh of Egypt, had just piled riches on Abraham to get him out of the country. Go and take all this stuff. And so the very father of God's people was rich because God redirected some stuff from Egypt into the hands of Abraham. And then later, when the children of Abraham, the children of Israel, have been slaves in Egypt for 400 years, and God has brought these 10 plagues on Pharaoh and on the whole nation of Egypt, and he is getting ready to, Pharaoh's going to let the people go. It's worked, and Pharaoh is saying, yes, just please get out of here so God will stop this. And the people are saying, yes, please get out of here so God will stop this. God apparently told his people, go door to door and ask them for their stuff. Ask them for silver and for gold, and also ask them for things you need like clothes. Because it says in Exodus 36 that that's exactly what they did. And so, can you just imagine this picture? I mean, they've put the blood on their doorpost and they're getting the lamb ready and they're making the unleavened bread and everything is in a hurry, and yet they go from door to door and they just ask. And it says the people of Egypt willingly just gave them their stuff. And it says that in this way the Israelites plundered Egypt. Now, that just God's everything belongs to him. That stuff didn't belong to Egypt. It belonged to God, and he proved it. He moved it around. Now, did he do that simply to benefit Israel? They were his people, and he did want to benefit them. But think about this. All those necessities, and we're not told what they are. We're just told clothes and basic necessities, but I'm imagining clothes and shoes and tents and cooking pots and whatever else it is. Do you know those are the very things that they used for 40 years? And through God's providence, they never wore out? All that gold and silver and precious metals that Egypt just said, here, take it, just be gone. You know what that was used for? To build the tabernacle. And to make it beautiful in honor of this beautiful God that we serve. Everything belongs to God. There's a true story that's told of a school in Texas that was preparing and training ministers during the Depression. And like a lot of institutions, they were in dire need. And the founders of the school got together in a room and they got on their knees and they began to pray, God, we need help. And one of the founders prayed, God, and he was thinking about Psalm 50, and he said, God, would you provide from the cattle on 1,000 hills? We need help. And literally at that moment, someone walked into the office and handed the secretary a check, and I don't know how much the check was for, but he had sold 2 carloads of cows, and he brought the check to that school, and she went into the founders, knocked on the door and interrupted them and handed it to them, and the president of the school saw what it was, and he stopped the prayer, and he said, well, folks, God just sold some cattle. I'm reminded of a story that actually our congregation got to be a part of. But it was a long, long time ago, like 90 years ago. Again, during the Depression, again, a lot of institutions that relied on giving from churches were really struggling and hurting, trying to keep their doors open. And one of those was Abilene Christian College. And there's another church school, a Baptist school in Abilene called Hardin-Simmons. And they received a pretty significant amount of money at Hardin-Simmons to keep the school going. And the president at Abilene Christian knew about it, heard about it, and found out that it came from somebody in Burnett, Texas. So the president of Abilene Christian contacted a man named Burton Kaufman, who had just graduated from Abilene and had moved to this church as an associate minister. And if you know anything about Church of Christ history, Burton Kaufman became a pretty well-known guy. He apparently was a pretty dynamic and talented young man, and the president knew that, so he contacted Burton, and he said, I want you to go to Burnett, and I want you to meet a man up there named Mr. Hardin, because he's been known to give to churches, schools, and I want you to ask him if he'll help us. And so he did, and he did. And today there is a building at Abilene Christian called the Hardin Administration Building that is in his honor because he helped keep Abilene Christian afloat during the Depression. But if you read a little more into his story, He made his first $1 million as a farmer and a rancher and a storekeeper up around Burke-Burnett, eventually accumulated 4,000 acres of land. Now that made him a pretty wealthy guy. But that just became exponential wealth when oil was discovered on 4,000 acres of land in the boom that we call Boomtown up in Burke-Burnett in the 1920s. And out of that just abundant riches that God blessed him, because he and his wife were people of God, out of the abundant riches that he was blessed with, he just began to give because he couldn't outgive God. And Mr. John G. Hardin, first of all, gave the plots of land and helped build the Baptist church in Burke and the Methodist church in Burke and the Church of Christ in Burke. And I know some of you have history at that church. Mr. Hardin helped make that church building possible. Then he and his wife gave $400,000 to start Hardin Junior College, which today we call Midwestern State University. I don't have this detail exactly correct, I don't think, but either he founded or he helped start Mary Hardin Baylor, where Evie Parks just graduated from school. And still today, Hardin Simmons in Abilene carries his name. With all that oil money, all the giving that God gave to him, he just passed it on. And apparently they had become kind of bankers and mortgagers across Burke, and they just, across the board, paid off a quarter of the mortgages of all of the loans that people had taken out with them. They paid off, I already said they donated the land and buildings for churches, also for schools and parks. They paid off all the outstanding public school bond. They paid for a power plant to provide electricity to the city of Burke and then gave it to the city. And the list just goes on and on. Mr. and Mrs. Hardin understood that it all belonged to God. It wasn't theirs. They were just stewards. They were caretakers. And that's the way that God works. It all belonged to Him. A cattle on 1,000 hills, oil under 1,000 acres. It all belonged to Him. None of it is mine. And I think that is the really important lesson from Psalm 50. It all belongs to God. What He does is for a time He puts it in our hands. And in His economy, the way it works is you give it. You give it when you see someone who has a need. You give it when a brother and a sister need help. You give it when the poor need help. You give it when someone who has less than you needs something. And you give it because God gave it to you. And you do it with open hands and open palms. See, because God doesn't do this. God does this. And it's what He wants from His people. And so, in this sermon, hear me say, folks, keep going through the rituals. Keep going through the rhythms. Because you're influencing someone who's watching you do that. But don't ever forget the heart of the matter. Don't ever forget to be like God.